At my wedding reception, as I was about to cut the cake with my new husband, my father clinked his champagne glass for a toast. "This should have been your sister's day," he announced to the stunned crowd. "She's always been the responsible one." I calmly set down the cake knife, pulled out my phone, and projected his text messages onto the reception hall screen. Messages that revealed the truth he'd been hiding for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The grand ballroom of the Bellamy Hotel in Chicago fell silent as 200 pairs of eyes darted between my father's rapidly paling face and the damning evidence displayed behind him. The elegant space, with its crystal chandeliers and ivory rose centerpieces, had transformed from a scene of celebration to the setting of a long-overdue reckoning. My sister Emily stood frozen near the head table, her champagne glass suspended halfway to her lips, her expression a complex mixture of shock and something else, relief perhaps. My mother Angela clasped her hands to her chest, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the horror dawning on her face. Just 30 minutes earlier, the reception had been everything I dreamed of. Daniel, my husband of exactly 7 hours, had been spinning me around the dance floor, his eyes reflecting the fairy lights strung across the ceiling. Our first dance as husband and wife had been perfect, his hands steady at my waist, my ivory dress flowing around us as our guests watched with genuine delight. "I love you, Olivia Campbell," he had whispered, still getting used to my new surname. "I love you too," I'd replied, feeling truly completely happy for the first time in years. And then my father, Robert Winters, successful investment banker and master of emotional manipulation, had decided it was time for his speech. I'd known it was coming. I'd prepared for it. But the actual words still cut deep. "I want to make a toast to my daughter," he'd begun, his voice carrying that familiar, authoritative tone that had dominated my childhood. "Olivia has always been spirited, determined to do things her own way." The way he said spirited made it sound like a character flaw. I felt Daniel's hand tighten protectively around mine under the table. When she told us she was marrying Daniel after just 18 months together, well, I had my concerns. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd. Her sister Emily has always been the planner, the one who thinks things through. She's been with her boyfriend for 5 years, building a solid foundation. My sister shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding my gaze. "In fact," my father continued, his voice growing louder, more confident in his righteousness, "I've always thought Emily would be the first to walk down the aisle. This should have been your sister's day." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Daniel's jaw tightened. My best friend Rachel, seated at the table nearest to us, made a small, outraged sound, but I remained completely calm. I had expected this. I had known exactly what would happen, because this was my father's pattern, to undermine every achievement, every happy moment of my life, and somehow make it about my sister. I looked at my father, really looked at him, in his expensive tailored suit and his polished cufflinks, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. A man who had spent decades building a public image of the perfect father, while systematically destroying my self-confidence behind closed doors. "You know what, Dad?" I said, my voice surprisingly steady as I stood up. "I think it's time everyone knew the truth about our family." I reached into my beaded clutch and pulled out my phone. With 3 quick taps, I connected it to the reception hall's projection system, a feature I'd specifically requested from the venue, though not for the reasons they had assumed. "What are you doing?" my father hissed, his public mask slipping just enough for me to see the anger beneath. "I'm finally standing up for myself," I replied, loud enough for the front tables to hear. And then the first text message appeared, on the screen blown up large enough for everyone to read. From my father to my mother, dated just 3 weeks ago. "I don't care what Olivia wants. We're not paying for a band. Emily's wedding will be the big one. This is just a trial run." My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Another text, this one to my sister. "Just humor your sister's wedding planning. We'll do yours properly. Hers won't last anyway." And then the most damning one of all, sent to his brother. my Uncle Thomas. Forcing myself to attend this farce of a wedding. Daniel doesn't come from the right background. Should have been. Emily and Bradley this year. At least he's from a good family. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. My father lunged toward me, reaching for my phone, but Daniel stepped smoothly between us. "That's enough, Robert," he said quietly, his voice laced with a steel I'd never heard before. My father looked around wildly, suddenly aware of his audience. Colleagues from his firm, friends from his golf club, clients who trusted him with millions of dollars, all witnessing his carefully constructed facade crumbling in real time. These are taken out of context," he stammered, his confident demeanor evaporating like morning dew. Olivia has always been sensitive, always misinterpreting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I think your exact words speak for themselves, Dad," I interrupted, my voice still eerily calm. "Just like they did when I was accepted to Northwestern instead of Harvard. Just like they did when I chose journalism instead of finance. Just like they did when I bought my first apartment without your help. For 27 years, I had endured my father's subtle and not so subtle comparisons to my sister. Emily was the responsible one, the practical one, the one who followed the path he had laid out. I was the disappointment, the rebel, the one who couldn't quite measure up to his expectations." My sister stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Stop it," she said, but I wasn't sure if she was talking to me or our father. "I'm sorry, Emily," I said genuinely, meaning it, "but this isn't about you. It never was. It's about him and what he's done to both of us." The truth was, Emily had been as much a victim of our father's manipulation as I had been. She was just on the pedestal instead of beneath it. She had spent her entire life trying to maintain her position as the favored child, following every directive, suppressing her own dreams to fit his vision. I turned to the gathered guests, many of whom were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to leave or stay for the unfolding drama. "I apologize for this unusual wedding entertainment," I said, attempting a small smile. "But I've spent my entire life being compared to my sister, being told I wasn't enough, that my choices weren't valid. Today was supposed to be about love, the incredible love I've found with Daniel. I refuse to let it be tainted by the same old pattern." I looked directly at my father, whose face had transformed from anger to calculation, already planning how to spin this, how to make me the villain in this narrative. "Dad, I love you," I said, surprising even myself with the truth of that statement, "but I'm done letting you define my worth. I'm done with the comparisons, with the subtle put-downs, the constant implication that my life would be better if I were more like Emily." My mother had begun to cry silently, mascara tracking down her carefully blushed cheeks. My father stood rigid, his knuckles white around his empty champagne glass. "You've ruined your own wedding," he finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "I hope you're satisfied." That was when Daniel stepped forward, taking the microphone. From its stand, his normally gentle face was set in determined lines. "Actually, Robert," he said, his voice echoing through the now silent ballroom, "I think Olivia just made our wedding unforgettable, because today she didn't just marry me. She finally stood up for herself. I couldn't be prouder to call her my wife." A sudden burst of applause erupted from Rachel's table, quickly spreading until nearly half the room was clapping. Ow. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the ballroom, my mother hesitating only briefly before hurrying after him. Emily remained, standing awkwardly between our table and the exit, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know," she whispered as I approached her. "I swear, Liv, I didn't know he was doing this." I believed her. Emily had been so thoroughly wrapped up in our father's expectations that she'd developed an almost tunnel vision, focused solely on meeting his ever-shifting standards of success. "I know," I said, hugging her tightly. "This isn't your fault." As we embraced, the band, the one my father had grudgingly agreed to pay for, began to play again, a slow, gentle melody. that gradually pulled the attention of our guests away from the family drama and back to the celebration. Daniel approached, resting his hand gently on my back. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 27 years of inadequacy beginning to lift from my shoulders. "I think I will be," I replied honestly. The wedding continued. We cut the cake, we danced, we laughed with our friends. But beneath the surface of the celebration, something fundamental had shifted. I had finally confronted the pattern that had defined my entire life. The subtle psychological warfare that had shaped my self-perception since childhood. As I looked around at the reception, at my friends dancing, at Daniel smiling at me from across the room, at my sister deep in conversation with her boyfriend Bradley, I realized that this was truly the first day of my new life. Not just because I had married the man I loved, but because I had finally broken free from the prison of my father's expectations. Later that night, as Daniel and I rode the elevator up to the honeymoon suite, he pulled me close. "I've never been prouder of anyone in my life," he murmured against my hair. "I'm sorry about the drama," I said, suddenly feeling guilty about the spectacle. He tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his gaze. "Don't apologize for standing up for yourself, ever." In our suite, surrounded by rose petals and champagne that the hotel staff had prepared, I kicked off my uncomfortable wedding shoes and collapsed onto the plush bed. Daniel sat beside me, loosening his tie. "You know this isn't over," he said, gently. "Your father isn't going to just accept what happened tonight." I nodded, staring up at the ornate ceiling. "I know. But for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of his reaction. I'm not afraid of his disappointment." Daniel stretched out beside me, propping himself up on one elbow. "How long have you been planning this?" I turned to face him, tracing the familiar contours of his face with my eyes. "Remember last Christmas?" He nodded. It had been our first holiday together as an engaged couple. My parents had invited us to their sprawling lakeside home in Michigan for their annual Christmas gathering, an event more about impressing my father's business associates than celebrating the holiday. "My father cornered you in his study," I continued. "He offered you that job at his firm." Daniel's expression darkened at the memory. "And when I told him I was happy teaching high school history, he suggested I wasn't ambitious enough for his daughter. But he meant for Emily," I finished. "Said Emily deserves someone with more drive. Even though you were engaged to me, not her." It had been a small slip, but a revealing one. In that moment, I had realized that my father didn't just prefer my sister in his mind, he actually confused us sometimes. I wasn't real to him as an individual, just a disappointing version of the daughter he wanted. That night I started saving the texts, I explained. Every message where he compared us, every time he undermined me, or suggested that Emily would do better. At first, it was just for my own sanity, proof that I wasn't imagining things. But then, as the wedding got closer and his comments became more frequent, I realized I had to do something. I couldn't start our marriage with his voice in my head. Daniel pulled me closer, his arm around my waist. "You're the bravest person." "I know," he whispered, but I didn't feel brave. I felt exhausted, drained from the confrontation, yet somehow lighter, as if I'd been carrying a heavy backpack for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "Do you think he'll ever speak to me again?" I asked, surprising myself with how little the answer seemed to matter. Daniel considered. This, his historian's mind, analyzing the possibilities. "I think you'll try to rewrite history. Make tonight about your emotional instability rather than his behavior. But speak to you? Eventually? People like your father can't stand being excluded." I nodded, knowing he was right. My father's greatest fear wasn't losing his daughters, it was losing control of the narrative, losing his audience. "What about Emily?" Daniel asked gently. That was more complicated. My sister and I had always had a strange relationship. Not quite friends, not quite rivals. We had been positioned as competitors by our father for so long that we'd never learned how to truly be sisters. "I don't know," I admitted. "I think tonight was as much of a shock to her as it was to him. Maybe more." "Bye," Daniel kissed my forehead. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." I drifted toward sleep in my husband's arms, still wearing my wedding dress. I realized that tonight had been a different kind of vow than the ones we'd exchanged at the altar. I had promised not just to love Daniel, but to finally love myself enough to demand the respect I deserved. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Sunlight streamed through the crack in the heavy hotel curtains, casting a golden stripe across the rumpled bedspread. Daniel was still asleep, his face peaceful in repose. I reached for my phone, expecting a barrage of angry messages from my father. Instead, I found a single text from Emily. "Can we meet for coffee? Just us?" I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to refuse to protect the fragile peace I'd found. But another part, the part that had always longed for a real relationship with my sister, made me type, "Lobby cafe in an hour?" Her response was immediate. "I'll be there." I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Daniel, and showered quickly, washing away the last traces of hairspray and wedding makeup. As I dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, clothes for my new life, I tried to prepare myself for whatever Emily might say. The lobby cafe was nearly empty when I arrived. Just a few business travelers typing on laptops while sipping overpriced espresso. Emily was already there, seated at a corner table with 2 steaming mugs in front of her. "I ordered you a latte," she said as I approached. "2 sugars, right?" I nodded, surprised she remembered. "Thanks." We sat in awkward silence for a moment, both of us searching for the right words to bridge the chasm that had always existed between us, now made wider by last night's revelations. "I'm sorry," Emily finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked up from my coffee, startled. "For what?" "For not seeing it," she replied, meeting my gaze directly. "For being so wrapped up in trying to be perfect for Dad that I never noticed what he was doing to you." To us. I hadn't expected this. I'd prepared for defensiveness, for accusations, for her to take our father's side as she always had. Vulnerability from my always composed sister was entirely new territory. "After you left last night, Bradley and I had a long talk," she continued, tucking a strand of her perfectly straight blonde hair behind her ear. "He's been trying to tell me for years that Dad's expectations were excessive, but I didn't. Want to hear it? I thought if I just worked hard enough, was good enough, eventually Dad would be satisfied. I recognized that feeling all too well. The constant striving for an approval that never quite materialized. "It's not your fault," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "He put us in impossible positions. You as the golden child, me as the disappointment. Neither role was fair." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but I participated. In it, I accepted the praise, the favoritism. I let myself believe I deserved it because I followed his rules. "You were a child, Em. We both were, and then we just continued the patterns we'd learned." She reached across the table and took my hand, the first genuine, unprompted gesture of affection between us in years. "Last night, after seeing those texts, Bradley asked me something that kept me up all night," she said, her voice unsteady. "He asked if I even want to be a corporate lawyer, or if I've just been following Dad's blueprint for my life." I waited, giving her space to continue. And I realized, "I don't know," she admitted, a single tear tracking down her cheek. "I've been so focused on meeting expectations that I never stopped to figure out what I actually want." In that moment, I saw my sister clearly, perhaps for the first time, not as my father's favorite, not as my competitor, but as another woman trying to find her way out of the maze of someone else's expectations. "It's not too late, you know," I said gently. "To figure that out?" Emily wiped her eyes with a napkin. "How did you do it? How did you find the courage to go your own way?" I thought about my winding path, the rejected Harvard acceptance in favor of Northwestern's journalism program, the turned-down internship at my father's firm, tiny apartment in a questionable neighborhood when I got my first reporting job. Each decision, a small act of rebellion that had ultimately led me to a career I loved and a partner who supported me. "One choice at a time," I answered honestly. It wasn't courage, not really. It was survival. I knew I'd wither away completely. If I tried to live his version of my life, Emily nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. That's how I've been feeling, like I'm slowly disappearing. We talked for almost 2 hours, really talked, perhaps for the first time in our adult lives. She confessed that she'd been secretly taking photography classes for the past year, a passion our father had dismissed as a hobby, not a career. I told her about the investigative piece I was working on that could either make or break my career. We compared notes on our childhood, filling in gaps in each other's understanding of our shared history. As we were preparing to leave, Emily asked the question I'd been dreading. What happens now? With Dad? I sighed, stirring the cold remnants of my second latte. I don't know. I don't want to cut him out completely, but I can't go back to the way things were. Me neither, Emily said with surprising firmness. Not after seeing those texts, understanding what he's been doing all these years. We walked back toward the elevator together, an unfamiliar sense of solidarity between us. Olivia, Emily said as we reached the elevators, I'm glad you found Daniel. And I'm really glad you stood up to Dad last night. Maybe you've given me the courage to start figuring out what I actually want. I hugged her impulsively, and after a moment of surprise, she hugged me back fiercely. When I returned to our suite, Daniel was up, dressed, packing our suitcase for the honeymoon we were scheduled to leave for that afternoon. How was coffee with Emily? He asked, folding a t-shirt with military precision. Surprisingly good. I replied, still processing the unexpected turn our relationship had taken. I think we might actually become friends. Daniel smiled, crossing the room to kiss me. That's wonderful. It's strange, I mused, as I helped him finish packing. I spent so many years resenting her for being the favorite, never realizing she was trapped to, just in a different way. As we prepared to leave for our flight to Bali, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Your father and I need to speak with you when you return. This isn't over. Shh. I showed it to Daniel, who frowned. Are you okay? I considered the question carefully, searching my feelings. The old me would have been anxious, already rehearsing explanations and apologies. But something fundamental had shifted inside me during the wedding reception, solidified during my conversation with Emily. Yes, I said with certainty, I am. Okay. Whatever conversation happens when we get back, I'm not the same person who would have dreaded it before. Daniel squeezed my hand. No, you're definitely not. As we left the hotel, stepping into the bright Chicago sunshine as husband and wife, I realized that my wedding day had given me 2 gifts. A partnership with the man I loved, and the first real steps toward freedom from the psychological chains that had bound me for 27 years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. My father wouldn't simply accept his new reality. Our mother would try to broker peace at any cost. The family dynamics wouldn't transform overnight. But for the first time, I felt equipped to face whatever came next, not as the perpetual disappointment, but as a woman who had found her voice and wasn't afraid to use it. To understand how I ended up exposing my father at my own wedding, you need to see the pattern that shaped my entire life. A pattern so subtle, yet devastating, that it took me years to fully recognize it. Looking back, I can trace it to a specific moment when I was 14 years old. That was when I first realized that in my father's eyes, I would always be second best. It was the regional science fair at Lincoln High School in suburban Chicago. The gymnasium was transformed into a sea of trifold poster boards, each student standing nervously beside their project. Emily, 16 at the time, had created an impressive display on water pollution in Lake Michigan, complete with water samples and a working filtration model. My project was on the psychology of color and how it affects mood, less flashy. But I'd spent months researching and conducting surveys. When the judges announced the winners, I was called up for second place. The blue ribbon felt substantial. In my hand, a validation of all my hard work, Emily received honorable mention, her first time not placing in the top 3. I remember feeling a complicated mix of pride in my own achievement and sympathy for my sister. After the ceremony, I searched for my parents in the crowd, eager to show them my ribbon. I spotted them near the exit doors. My mother gave me a quick hug, but my father's reaction is what stays with me to this day. Second place? He said, examining my ribbon with a slight frown. Not bad, Olivia. But don't get too excited. The competition wasn't exactly fierce this year. He glanced over at Emily, who was trying to appear unfazed by her lesser placement. Don't worry, Em. Everyone has an off day. You'll bounce back next year. First place, I'm sure of it. The car ride home was excruciating. The entire 20 minutes analyzing what had gone wrong with Emily's project, offering suggestions for improvement, assuring her that this minor setback wouldn't affect her college applications. My blue ribbon lay forgotten on the seat beside me. That night, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. Robert, you could have been a little more enthusiastic about Olivia's ribbon, my mother said, her voice carrying that tentative quality. It always had when she disagreed with him. Angela, be realistic, my father replied. Emily's the one with the scientific mind. She's going places. Olivia's project was about colors making people feel happy or sad. It's hardly groundbreaking. Research. She worked hard on it, my mother protested weakly. Of course she did. And second place is fine for Olivia. I'm just saying we shouldn't set unrealistic expectations. Emily's the one who could really make something of herself if she stays focused. I stood frozen in the hallway, my teenage heart cracking at the casual cruelty of his assessment. It wasn't that he disliked me in some ways, that might have been easier to bear. It was that he had decided, with absolute certainty, what each of his daughters was capable of. Emily was destined for greatness. I was destined for fine. That science fair set the pattern for the next 13 years of my life. Every achievement of mine was measured against Emily's. Every success slightly diminished. Every setback proof of my father's low expectations. When I was accepted to Northwestern on a partial journalism scholarship, my father's response was, "It's no Harvard, but Northwestern has a decent program." Emily was already at Harvard, studying pre-law, following precisely the path our father had laid out for her. There's still time to switch to business or economics, he suggested during my college orientation. Journalism is a dying field, Olivia. Be practical. I didn't switch. Despite his predictions of unemployment and irrelevance, I thrived in the journalism program. I loved the rush of chasing stories, the satisfaction of crafting narratives. That illuminated truth. By my junior year, I was the editor of the campus newspaper and had secured a coveted summer internship at the Chicago Tribune. The day I called home to share the news about the internship, Emily had just been accepted into a prestigious law clerk position. My news became a footnote in the family call. "That's nice, Olivia," my father said absently. "Did Emily tell you?" "About her clerkship, Judge Williams personally requested her. Do you know how rare that is? This wasn't Emily's fault. She never asked to be the measuring stick against which my life was judged. In fact, as we grew older, I could see her becoming increasingly uncomfortable with our father's blatant favoritism. She would try to redirect conversations back to my accomplishments, would send me private congratulatory texts when our father overlooked my successes. But she was caught in the same toxic dynamic, just from the other side. After college, I moved into a tiny studio apartment in Chicago's uptown neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, paid for with my entry-level reporter salary without a dime from my parents. I was covering local politics for a digital news outlet, building a reputation for thorough, insightful reporting. Emily, meanwhile, had started at our father's firm after graduating from Harvard Law with honors. She lived in a luxury high-rise downtown, her rent subsidized by our parents. On the surface, her life looked perfect. Prestigious job, beautiful apartment, long-term. Boyfriend from a good family. But when we would meet for our occasional sisterly coffees, I caught glimpses of a profound unhappiness behind her perfectly maintained exterior. "Do you actually like corporate law?" I asked her once, about 2 years after her graduation. We were sitting at a window table in a cafe near her office, Emily dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. She stared into her espresso for a long moment before answering. "Doesn't matter if I like it," she finally said. "I'm good at it. Dad needs someone to eventually take over his client relationships. That's not what I asked Em." She met my eyes briefly, then looked away. "I don't hate it. Not hating your life's work seemed like a tragically low bar, but I didn't push." Emily had always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed rough edges and avoided conflict. Challenging our father's plan for her life would require a confrontation I wasn't sure she was capable of having. My personal rebellion continued in my career choices, but it extended to my love life as well. I met Daniel Carter during my 3rd year at the news outlet. I was covering a school board meeting about a controversial new history curriculum, and he was the high school teacher who had developed it. Unlike the polished finance brothers Emily introduced at family gatherings, Daniel wore corduroy jackets with elbow patches and had a passion for making history accessible to teenagers. Our first date was at a tiny Ethiopian restaurant where we shared a large platter of food, eating with our hands and talking until the owner politely informed us they were closing. Daniel was thoughtful, genuinely interested in my work, and refreshingly direct about his own life and ambitions. I could make more money in a private school, he told me over coffee on our 3rd date, but the kids in the public system, they're the ones who need teachers who care. When I finally brought Daniel to meet my parents, 6 months into our relationship, my father's disapproval was immediate and unmistakable. He asked probing questions about Daniel's salary, his retirement plan, his family background. Each answer seemed to confirm my father's worst suspicions that I had chosen someone thoroughly unsuitable. A teacher? Olivia? Really? He said. When Daniel excused himself to the restroom, I thought you'd outgrow this rebellious phase. It's not a phase, Dad. I care about him. Of course you do. He's perfectly nice. But think long term. What kind of life can he provide? Emily's. Bradley is already on track to make partner at his firm by I bit back a retort about what really constituted a good life. It wasn't worth the argument. My father's value system was immovable. Success meant money, prestige, and social status. Anything else was failure. Despite my father's obvious disapproval, Daniel and I grew closer. He supported my career ambitions, celebrating each article I published, each source I cultivated. I admired his dedication to his students, the way he lit up when talking about making history relevant to disaffected teenagers. Our engagement, after 18 months together, was a mutual decision made on an ordinary Tuesday evening. We were cooking dinner in my apartment, now our apartment, chopping vegetables side by side. I think we should get married, Daniel said casually, as if suggesting we try a new restaurant. I looked up from the onion I was dicing. You proposing? To me while I'm crying over onions? He grinned. I'm proposing to you while we're doing the mundane, everyday thing that makes me happiest, just being alongside you. There was no ring, no grand gesture, just the sincere recognition that we wanted to build a life together. It was perfect. My parents' reaction was exactly what I expected. My mother offered congratulations, tinged with concern. My father didn't bother to hide his disappointment. You've known him for what, a year? He said dismissively. 18 months, I corrected. Well, that changes everything, he replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Emily and Bradley have been together for 4 years, and they're not rushing into anything. We're not rushing. Dad, and this isn't about Emily and Bradley. In my father's mind, everything was about Emily and Bradley. They were the gold standard, the relationship against which all others should be measured. The fact that they weren't engaged after 4 years wasn't a sign of uncertainty in his view, but of prudence. The wedding planning became a battlefield. Every decision became an opportunity for my father to remind me that I was doing things wrong, that Emily's future wedding, still entirely hypothetical, would be done properly. The venue I chose, a renovated industrial space with exposed brick and spectacular city views, was unconventional. My decision to have a friend officiate rather than the minister from my parents' church was disrespectful to tradition. My desire for a small wedding party, rather than a dozen bridesmaids, was excluding family. But the real conflict erupted over money. My father had always made it clear that he would pay for both his daughters' weddings. It was a point of pride for him. But his financial support came with strings attached. If we're paying, we should have some say in the decisions, he insisted during a particularly tense dinner at my parents' home 3 months before the wedding date. We appreciate your contribution, Daniel said diplomatically. But ultimately, this is our wedding. My father's eyes narrowed. When you're footing the bill yourself, you can make all the decisions you want. It was a clear threat. Fall in line or lose the funding. Daniel and I exchanged a glance across the table, a silent communication passing between us. "You know what?" said, setting down my fork. "We'll pay for it ourselves." My father scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Olivia, on your salaries. It would be a backyard barbecue, and that's what it will be," Daniel replied firmly. "We'd rather have a wedding that reflects who we are than one that meets someone else's expectations." That night, as we drove home in tense silence, I felt both terrified and strangely liberated. Planning a wedding on our modest combined incomes would mean scaling back significantly, taking on debt, or postponing the date. "We can make this work," Daniel said, reaching for my hand across the center console. "Maybe not the venue we wanted, but something just as meaningful." I squeezed his hand, grateful beyond words for his steadfastness. "I'm sorry about my father. Don't apologize for him. Not ever again." The next morning, Emily called me. "Dad told me what happened," she said without preamble. I sighed, preparing for another lecture about respecting our parents' wishes. And I want to help. "Bradley and I, we have savings. We could loan you some money for the wedding." I was stunned into silence. This offer of financial assistance was the first time Emily had ever openly defied our father's position. "That's incredibly generous, Em, but I can't accept." "Why not?" she pressed. "It's just a loan. You can pay us back whenever." "Because it would put you in an impossible position with Dad. He'd see it as a betrayal." There was a long silence on the line. "Maybe it's time I stopped worrying so much about what Dad sees," she finally said, her voice uncharacteristically resolute. That conversation marked a subtle shift in my relationship with Emily. We began to talk more openly about our father's manipulation, the impossible standards he set, the way he had positioned us as competitors rather than allies. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, too many years of damage had been done for that, but it was the beginning of something new, a tentative solidarity. In the end, my mother secretly intervened on our behalf. She approached my father privately and somehow convinced him to honor his financial commitment to the wedding without the controlling strings attached. I never learned exactly what she said to him, but it must have been powerful. He agreed to transfer the money with minimal conditions, though his disapproval remained palpable in every interaction. As the wedding date approached, I began noticing a troubling pattern in my father's communications. His texts and emails became increasingly focused on Emily and Bradley, making pointed comparisons between their solid relationship and my hasty marriage plans. When wedding conversations arose during family dinners, he would inevitably steer them toward Emily's hypothetical future wedding. "When Emily gets married, we'll have it at the country club," he would say. "A proper venue for a proper occasion." These comments were nothing new. I'd endured similar comparisons my entire life, but as they accumulated in the context of my wedding, something shifted inside me. I began saving these messages, taking screenshots of particularly egregious texts, noting down verbatim quotes from conversations. Initially, I wasn't sure why I was documenting these incidents. Perhaps it was simply to validate my own experience, to prove to myself that I wasn't overreacting. But as my collection grew, so did my resolve. I began to see how these harmless comments formed a pattern of systematic undermining, a deliberate effort to diminish my happiness and elevate my sister. The text messages were particularly revealing. They showed a different side of my father than the charming, successful businessman he presented to the world. A text to my mother, forwarded to me accidentally. "Just let Olivia have her little wedding her way. It'll be over soon, and then we can focus on what matters." A message to my uncle. "Daniel seems nice enough, but he's not ambitious. She could have done better if she'd tried." And perhaps most painfully, a text to Emily that she showed me herself. Her eyes filled with conflicted loyalty. "Your sister has always rushed into things without thinking. This marriage is just another example. You're the one who makes me proud. M." 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel found me sitting on our bed, scrolling through my catalog of evidence, tears streaming down my face. "Liv, what's wrong?" he asked, sitting beside me, his arm warm around my shoulders. I showed him the texts, the emails, the notes I'd compiled. "This is what I've been dealing with my entire life," I said, "and I'm so tired of it, Daniel. Tired of being the disappointment, the cautionary tale, the negative example. Daniel read through some of the messages, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is emotional abuse, Olivia. You know that, right?" I'd never applied that term to my father's behavior. In my mind, emotional abuse involved yelling, name-calling, explicit cruelty. My father's techniques were subtler: comparisons, dismissals, backhanded compliments, but the cumulative effect was just as devastating. "What do you want to do about it?" Daniel asked quietly. I looked down at my phone at the damning evidence I'd collected. "I don't know yet. I can't keep pretending it's not happening. Can't keep smiling through his speeches and toasts when I know what he really thinks of me." Daniel nodded slowly. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. 100%. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my upcoming wedding day. A day that should be about love and new beginnings, not old wounds and family dynamics. I imagined my father giving a toast, saying all the right things publicly, while privately continuing to undermine my choices, my relationship, my very identity. Around 3 in the morning, I made my decision. I wouldn't confront him before the wedding. That would only lead to denials, minimizations, and my mother's tearful attempts to broker peace. No, if I was going to break this pattern, it needed to be decisive, undeniable, and public. I needed to expose the truth in a way that couldn't be dismissed or rewritten, and I knew exactly how to do it. The next day, I contacted the venue coordinator and asked about connecting my phone to their projection system. She assumed I wanted to display a photo slideshow during the reception and happily provided the technical details. I spent the next evening creating a carefully curated presentation of my father's texts and messages, not all of them, just the most revealing ones, the ones that showed the pattern most clearly. I didn't tell anyone about my plan, not Daniel, not Emily, not even my closest friends. This was a confrontation 13 years in the making, and I needed to see it through on my own terms. As the wedding week arrived and relatives began flying in from across the country, I maintained a facade of excited bride-to-be, all while finalizing my preparations for the moment of truth. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would stand, how I would remain calm when the chaos inevitably erupted. The night before the wedding, as Daniel and I parted ways for our last night as an unmarried couple, he's staying with his best man, me in our apartment. He took my hands in his. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "remember that I love you exactly as you are, not as a comparison to anyone else. It's not as a project to be improved. It's just you, Olivia Winter, soon to be Olivia Campbell." I kissed him, holding on to that moment of pure acceptance. "I love you too. Tomorrow is going to be unforgettable." He had no idea how right I was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. This one hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.